So what I'm going to be trying to do is to ask the kind of broad question of when parental homework involvement is beneficial and when it is detrimental for students' academic development. And I will present 5 studies, and this seems like a lot, but I'm not going to present everything that was included in those 5 studies, and I'm not going to present one study as much in depth as I would at one conference. I'm going to kind of give you an overview of what we did and the findings, and I chose those findings from the studies that actually relate to this overall question and that kind of give a broader perspective on it. So in the first study, we try to kind of test the hypothesis that it is actually the quality of involvement rather than the quantity of involvement that makes a difference. So that's the focus of the first study. In the second study, we then only focused on the quality of involvement, and instead of just looking at achievement, which we did in the first study, we tried to have a diverse set of outcomes, so also motivational outcomes and learning behaviors, because we regard this also as important. In study 3, we have tried to study if there are different involvement types in families. So instead of having a variable-centered approach, we were doing a person-centered approach, kind of trying to see if how these different dimensions actually relate together. In study 4, we went a step further, and by looking at the reciprocal relationships between children's academic functioning and also parents' homework, because it's usually not a one-way street, and that's actually what we find. And then finally, I want to say a few things about homework conflict, because that's oftentimes something that's discussed. Before I move into the individual studies, are there any clarifying questions about the general cultural context or the kind of approach that I'm taking? If not, it's fine. I just want to make sure that I'm not moving too quickly. Okay, just raise your hands if there are questions coming up. Okay, actually there's one more general thing I want to say. So I had the opportunity to be part of a lesson study in Tokyo yesterday, which was a very unique experience for me, because this is not something that we have in Germany, actually, for several reasons. So not only are students very autonomous, teachers are very autonomous too. So once you're finished with teacher education and you start teaching as a teacher, there's no formal way of kind of feedback on your teaching. So you, as soon as the door closes behind you, nobody will see how you teach and what you do with your students. And it's actually not very, it's not common at all to even talk about different teaching practices between teachers. So every teacher has their own kind of style and has their own way of teaching, and oftentimes just the basic information, they oftentimes don't have desks in school, so they will go home to prepare their lessons. So all their lesson preparation will be done individually. And so that also means they're quite skeptical of other people's observations and feedback. So kind of observing other people's instruction is not common at all. It's actually very, if somebody wants to observe somebody else's instruction, they will think something might be going wrong, or it's like they will be very skeptical. So teachers are don't like to be watched, and this also, so this happening inside schools, but that also applies to us researchers. So when we as researchers want to study classroom instruction, they're very hesitant to let us into the classrooms. They don't see the benefit of discussing with us, and they will be very, it needs a lot of convincing and a lot of sensitivity to tell them that we're not going to evaluate them, we just want to do this for research purposes, it's all going to be anonymous. And so this affects our research quite a bit, because not only is it harder to get into schools, and also it has to be officially approved by the Ministry of Education of every state to go into schools. But it's also, the kind of methodologies that we will use to study are also influenced by this. So we will do classroom observations where we just stand in the back and there's hardly any communication with teachers, or we will have surveys where we will come in for 1 hour and do the survey and then we will leave. So the actual sort of, what I at least saw yesterday, the kind of informal communication between educational researchers and educational practitioners does not happen. So you have to keep this in mind, that this is what we have to deal with. And I actually think I'm actually becoming quite critical of our way of, I mean, this is kind of a side note, of our way of doing research in Germany, because many researchers have not even seen one classroom once. They are conducting research even though they don't know how schools look like. And so I think we need to engage more with practitioners, and because you can also learn quite a lot from, I mean, you all know this, from practitioners, and that can feed into research. And oftentimes educational research in Germany is perceived as the research only feeding into practice and not the other way around. Anyway, so that's kind of a total discussion. And one of the reasons why both parents, teachers, and students are very skeptical of educational researchers in Germany is because of the PISA study. The very first PISA study, we were very bad, and so it was the so-called PISA shock in Germany. And when you go into elementary school or even any classroom in Germany and you ask what is PISA, they will not answer this is a city in Italy. They will tell you it's a study run by the OECD. So it's very well known, and so they're very skeptical. So just to keep this in mind, and maybe we can have a discussion about these cultural differences. Anyway, so this kind of explains the type of studies we've been conducting. So they're usually longitudinal. So all of the studies I'm presenting are longitudinal, meaning that we either had 2 measurement points at the beginning, at the end of the school year, or sometimes even over a longer stretch of time. We had questionnaire data, but we also have standardized achievement test data, usually achievement tests developed by psychometricians in our research groups. As I said, the studies I'm going to present were conducted in Germany and Switzerland. And what we did is we asked students how they perceived their parents' homework involvement in the homework process. Based on the idea that no matter what parents meant to do, we believe that it's important to have students' perceptions, because that's what actually impacts their own development. As I said, we have students' academic achievement in most of the studies, and then sometimes also measures of learning behavior and motivation. And all of the analyses I'm going to present were conducted using the M+ software, using either imputed data or the full information maximum likelihood estimator implemented in M+. And because all of the data were collected in schools, we account for the nested data structure in our models as well. So I'm not going to repeat all of these aspects for each of the studies because they apply to all of them. The same, we also have very similar measures for parental homework involvement across the several studies. So I'm giving you example items of those basically 3 dimensions. So we have, in some studies we call it intrusive involvement, in others control, sometimes as a result of the reviews we got. So, but it's actually meaning the same thing. So one example item for intrusive involvement would be, my parents help me with my homework even when I don't need any help. One example item for supportive involvement would be, or kind of autonomy supportive involvement would be, when I'm doing my homework, I can ask my parents for help anytime. So the students know they can approach parents, but it's not actually the parents kind of coming and helping without even asking if it's needed. And then the final dimension, structure, that's what I was referring to earlier. One example item would be, my parents make sure that I have enough time and space to do my homework. So providing structure in the home for homework.